Welcome to the Operation Move podcast. My name is Zoe, and this week we have a listener question, which is, after losing fitness, speed and endurance, how do you not lose faith in your training while you are making a comeback? And I thought this was probably going to be a great question for this week because I think that a lot of us are pretty much there. And it might not have been a really long period of loss of fitness, but I would say that most people have experienced some disruption over the last 4 to 6 weeks or so. And although you can have a break from running for about 2 weeks and not really have it impact you, once you 2-3 weeks, the drop off is pretty swift. And I think that can also be a little bit demoralizing this time of year, because normally you're getting into March and you're finally in April and finally hitting some form as it cools down. And I think that a fair few of us have had a bit of a reset, and that might not have happened the way we imagined it would. But of course, it can be a longer period, which I think can be a little bit more challenging. But in other ways, if it's a longer period, you're probably a little bit more patient too. But principles are the same, whether it's been a longer period of doing rehab from an injury for several months, or you've had a break for several months due to work or other commitments or whatever else you've got going on. The principles are the same. And I think that when you are making a comeback, I think probably one of the more challenging things is that you know enough to know how far you've got to go. And there's also this kind of disconnect between how you think something should feel and how it actually does feel. And that can be pretty frustrating, especially if it's something that you've been working on for quite a while, and you feel like you finally got to this point and that you wanted to build on it, and then something happened and you didn't get that opportunity. And that can also be where a level of the frustration is coming from as well. So it can be a bit of a frustration with that lack of consistency. Trusting the process is a bit of an interesting one in the scope of this question, because on the one hand, if it worked before to get you to that level of fitness that you're now disappointed about losing, then there's no reason why it wouldn't work again. So I think that usually the best indicator of what works is your history of training. So if something has worked in the past, then it's kind of easy to trust that it will work again. I think that where it can get dicey is maybe you feel like what you were doing in the past did get you to a certain level of fitness, but maybe you think that there was also a part of that maybe led to an injury that caused this break in training. That's definitely a possibility, and something, injuries can happen. So it's not necessarily the training, but it could be, or it could just be that the load over the course of your week isn't quite right, or that there are a couple of situations where you should have pulled back on or stopped where you didn't, and you pushed through, and that's just like a learning process. So it's not necessarily to sort of look back at and go, oh, well, this training happened and then I got injured. Sometimes training can just expose an injury waiting to happen. So this week I was doing a CrossFit workout at home, and at a certain point I sort of felt like my hip wasn't overly happy, but I kept going anyway, which is probably a mistake, a very easy one to make. And since then my TFL has been pretty cranky, and it's been sort of referring pain into my hip and into my lower back. And it's kind of been okay for running because it's only painful in rotation, which you don't really get a whole lot of rotation in running. So it hasn't really stopped me there, which is nice, but it's just kind of annoying. So I'm just sort of dealing with that at the minute. And it could be easy to go, oh, it was that CrossFit workout. Well, that's highly unlikely. Chances are I've aggravated my TFL and I've then done one thing to tip it over the edge. And chances are the reasoning behind that is just that with everything being on lockdown, probably had been out of my routine, pretty crappy diet, not doing my normal sort of like mobility and rolling, and definitely not getting to sort of like my regular appointments with sort of, I tend to go get a massage once a month. And all of those things can add up where you just have to be a lot more focused on your body maintenance. So it's often not like the thing, it's sort of like everything that leads up to the thing. But if you feel that the nature of training or the training load led you to that break, then yes, it would be hard to trust that process again. But you can take out the things that go, okay, like this worked, but I just need to take it down by 10%. So I'm going to add in an extra rest day here, or I'm going to have it be, one hard workout per week instead of two, and you can just sort of experiment with that a little bit. But I think that oftentimes it's less about trusting the process and more about being patient with the process because it takes time. So I think that a good guide for regaining fitness is that it's going to probably take you at least as long and probably a bit longer than what the gap period was. So, if you've had a period that's been a little bit haphazard lately of say about 4 weeks, then I would say it's probably going to take you about 4 to 6 weeks to get back where you were before the break. And just having that guideline can just sort of relax you a little bit as you're going through that process. And if it's longer, that's going to take longer. So, but it's good to have that endpoint, because I think that's what's hard about the current situation with the restrictions, is not knowing what the endpoint is. If everyone knew what the endpoint was, then it would be a whole lot easier to manage sort of what we have to do and how we feel about it and manage our stress levels. Because we don't know, it's really hard to do. But with something like this, you can go, okay, like I've had this kind of gap. It's going to take about this much longer to rebuild everything. And there is no reason to even like take in any data from like the first week or the second week or whatever it is. So the first thing you need to do is to set that timeline and have it be a realistic timeline. And that's going to be informed by like what your break has looked like. Because say, for example, if you've had a long break and it might have been like a complete break where you're not doing anything, where you're going to have to like completely rebuild your cardio fitness as well as your muscle skeletal sort of fitness for withstanding running, as well as just general strength and power and everything. If you're having to rebuild across the board, that's going to take longer. Whereas say, for example, if you've had an injury but you have been maintaining your fitness through work at the gym and by like doing some sessions on the bike or on the rower or whatever that you've had access to, that's going to be a little bit different, because your cardio fitness is going to be there, but your body isn't going to be used to the stress on your bones yet. So it can feel really strange at that point, because your lungs and heart, they're there, but your legs are just not quite up to the challenge. And that can often also be like a point where injuries can happen, because like one level of fitness is out of whack with the other level of fitness. So your time frame is going to be dependent on what your break looked like, what it composed of, and also why you took the break in the first place. So was it an injury? Were you just mentally exhausted? Was it life stresses? Like all of those things are going to come into it, and it's going to play out a little bit differently. But generally speaking, if you look at your comeback being 1 to 1.5 times whatever your break was, then you're going to be in pretty good shape, really. So that can help to take the pressure off, like how long is it going to take, like how much work am I going to have to put into this, all of that sort of stuff. On the one hand, you know that you can get back there because you've done it once before. And once you've done it before, it's easy enough to do. I think that the temptation to do with that, like that frustration and that difference between where you are now and where you were, is the temptation can be to push further than you need to push in those. So, you have an idea of what tempo pace is, or like what, like what your easy run pace is or whatever, and you can push for that. And then you can end up doing too much, and then you don't recover well, and then you don't adapt as you might imagine. So I think the other aspect of it is just really focusing on effort-based work instead of pace-based work. And that can help take the pressure off too. And it can be, it can be challenging to know that, well, normally I did this and today I did this. And it can, if you let it, it can be demotivating. But you have to keep your eye on the prize, which is consistency is what is going to get you back to where you were. So, if you do one thing and you overreach and you push it really hard, and then you end up not being able to do anything for 3 or 4 days because you're so smashed, that is going to be a lot less effective than doing something a little bit less, allowing your ego to suffer a bit, and then still being able to do all of your training through the week because you haven't completely annihilated your central nervous system. So, for example, today I had 10-minute tempo intervals with active recovery, which I did as about 30 seconds of walk to sort of recover a bit, and then I jogged for 2.5 minutes before the next interval. Now, I've had a sort of significant break between when I went down to Melbourne, sort of around about mid-March to now. So it's been about a month, and leading up to that, I'd also had a few kind of, seemingly unrelated niggles as well. So had sort of a bit of a high hamstring sort of micro tear, and then when I came back, I kind of sprained my ankle, and I've had this TFL situation, which you could take as completely unrelated and just a bunch of stuff that happened. But the reality is that they're probably not unrelated. They're probably to do with combination of probably stress is too high, self-care is too low, and possibly the training that I had been doing was just a bit too much. So it's good to look at that sort of stuff critically and not just go, oh, it's just running stuff, because it's not. It's I wasn't doing enough of my rehab stuff, and the running load was too high. The strength training to sustain that load was too low, and that's what happens. So there's been a significant break, and not just in terms of the actual distance I've been running, but I've done very limited actual sort of fast running, or tempo running or interval running, that kind of thing. So when I went out this morning, I chose to do it to heart rate so that I could keep it effort based rather than kind of chasing a pace in my head. And the reality of that is it ended up being around about in the vicinity of 450 pace for the 10 minutes, which I could easily get caught up in, because probably only, a couple of months ago or so, in much hotter conditions, I was running, 6.5 kilometers at 430 pace. So it would be easy for my ego to be disappointed with that. But you just have to definitely set that aside and know, okay, I was working in the right zone. The effort was where it needed to be. And having those types of sessions where I'm working hard but not overworking are what is going to create the consistency to take me back to that position that I was before. And doing it in a sustainable way where I have the energy to do the type of strength rehab that I need to do. Because it's easy to think, I have this thing and all I need to do is make time for these other things. But a lot of times with your running program, it's not about making time for the other things, because even with a relatively high volume program, you're always going to have time, but you're not always going to have energy. And so that's sort of like more what you're going with something that's sustainable, where I can come back from a workout and go, yep, I'm going to go into the garage and do my mobility now for a little bit. And then later on, I'm going to do, I think I've got like a push-up based workout that CrossFit sent me that I'll do. And to be able to do those things and not be so wiped out from today that makes those other things hard. So that would definitely be the next thing to focus on, is like, what can you be consistent with? What can you be sustainable with? And sometimes too, I find it really useful to look back at previous training cycles. So you can see, like, I started here and this is where I finished and this is what I did in the middle. And that can be quite motivating. And even like in my time hop, I've been seeing all of this stuff about, because like this time of year was just around about the time of year that I ran my half marathon PB at Canberra. I was super fit. So all the stuff in my time off, like it could go one or two ways. Like it would be demotivated by it because it's like, oh my God, I'm nowhere near that anymore. Or you can find it motivating. Like I did all of that, I got there. And what really sticks out to me about it is all of the rehab and biomechanical type strength stuff that I was making time for and had energy for. And so that can also be a really useful tool, because oftentimes in your mind you don't necessarily remember like all of those little pieces. So going back into a training diary or a training log and looking at like all of those sessions where you hit it out of the park, but also all of those sessions that sucked, or where you didn't do what you'd hoped that you would do, or whatever, So I think that can be really useful. And if you haven't kept a training diary, then when you are focusing on a comeback, it's a great place to start. So I've started with a new running coach last week, and which is also in Final Surge, which is very convenient for me because I do all of my coaching in Final Surge. So just going to one place is great. And I've just been diligent about writing down how I felt on those sessions. So like it automatically imports whatever my watch data is, but then I'll go in. I always put down what the temperature and humidity was because I did my first quality session the other day. It was like obscenely humid. So I like my coach to know exactly how humid it was when I did the work. But I've also just written down how I felt, like with the quality sessions, like how that is feeling on my body, with the recovery, like how recovered did I actually feel. And I think that there's also often a temptation when you are working with a coach to hide the things that you're not happy about. So like, say for example, when you are kind of like with my TFL at the minute, the temptation would definitely not to be saying anything about it because I don't want it to be real. But it is real. So like today I said, like, this session didn't really affect the TFL, but it's a thing and I'm working on it and we'll just need to keep an eye on it. And I said the same thing to my strength coach, which is like, I've twinged this. I don't think I should do thrusters today. Can we swap it for something else? That kind of thing. So, definitely live in reality when you are putting stuff in your training diary, but it's useful to just have that as a guide, because then you don't always know what it's going to look like at the time, but 12 weeks from now, 6 months from now, I can look back on that and say, this is all the things that I did and this is what happened. And then I'm going to be able to like compare that cycle to say like one of my better cycles, and I'm going to be able to see which was the most effective for me. And you're going to start to see patterns emerge as well. And I guess the other thing that's really important with a comeback is, for the most part, it's not your speed or your endurance or your fitness that is why you enjoy running. Like it feels great when you're super fit to be going out and running, because workouts feel easier and easy feels easier, and like everything feels pretty amazing. So I totally get that, but by the same token, it's not why you are out there running. So I think keeping a really strong connection to why you're there and what you're doing and what you would be doing if you never improved ever again. And I think that depending on when your comeback is happening, that can be easier at some times of the year than others. Like this time of the year I think is really easy because it's such beautiful running weather. Sometimes when you're kind of like coming back and it's like hideously hot and humid, that can be, find your like why you're out there can be like a little bit more of a challenge. But even so, I think that there are always things, like I always like to have a focus on why I'm there that has nothing to do pace I'm running, session I'm doing, what I'm training for, any of that. That's completely independent. So I think there's a lot to be said in those sort of comeback stages of really like finding what you love about it, finding what's joyful for you that is separate from those kind of metrics, because you're always going to have like periods where you feel like workouts haven't gone well, and you need that's sort of constant to sustain you through those periods. And so that is also a really important thing, that like you didn't, particularly if you've had an injury and you've worked your way through rehab, you sure as hell didn't do all of that work because you wanted to be like 5 seconds per kilometre faster at parkrun. There is no way you did all of that work for that. You did that work so that you could go and enjoy what you enjoy about running, which very rarely has anything to do with the time or event or anything else. Probably the final thing about this process of regaining fitness, because it probably will happen more quickly than when you were first starting, because you do have your long-term fitness, you've developed a lot of the biological systems, they're all sort of in place. Mentally, you also know that you've done all of this stuff before, so it's not as much of a mental hurdle. But it's also, sometimes it's hard to trust the process because you don't like the particular process that you're in. And what I mean by that is that sometimes you are just going to have certain styles of training that you just don't like. And if that is the case, then it is going to be pretty hard to see the kind of improvements that you want. And you can create as much of an, like quote, optimal training plan as you like, but it's only optimal if you enjoy it. And so if you look at, say, like, okay, like according to, like all of this training theory, you should be doing this stuff at high intensity and this stuff at moderate intensity and these hills for strength and, this aerobic stuff for base. But let's just say one of those things or two of those things or more you don't like. And so either you spend an inordinate amount of time trying to talk yourself into it, you spend the during disliking it, or you just avoid it entirely and don't do it. That is going to be significantly less effective than you're doing your, quote, less optimal thing of focusing on the things that you do actually enjoy. Now, initially, you might say, like, there's going to be a difference in what your adaptation is, but over years and years, you're far better off doing the things that you can be consistent at. And essentially, what you're losing in terms of like potential fitness or potential adaptation by not doing those other things. It's hypothetical because you're not going to do them anyway. Now, as a coach, I think there's definitely room for, like, say, for example, if somebody really dislikes a particular style of workout, like hill sprints or like continuous sort of like tempo run. Like, I think there's a way to program around it so you still get the sort of stimulus, but it's in a way that you can do better. So, and I think there's also room for challenging people to do things that there's a level of resistance to, but it is about finding that balance, between, what is something that somebody is going to fight with themselves over versus, and really dislike, versus something that they are going to enjoy and it's probably going to be just as good in the long haul. Like, you've got so many examples of like people who have done really disparate types of training and still end up at the with similar performances. So what works for one person isn't going to work for another person, and really I think that the most important thing is that you're excited about it. So I think that, and it's not to avoid things that you don't want to do necessarily, but even people who, say, for example, struggle a little bit with a particular type of workout ultimately often like doing it because of the feeling of accomplishment that they get at the end of that workout. If that's not the case for you, then it's probably just something that you can scrap. So I would also look at, maybe, is there something about this process that is inherently not working for you? Because that can make that comeback super challenging. And I think oftentimes for me, although there's not workouts that I particularly dislike. I mean, I always get a bit intimidated by tempo workouts, but who doesn't? But I still enjoy doing them. I think for me, that part of the process that I tend to avoid in training, because I don't like it, is repeated workouts. I really don't like repeated workouts. I think it's too easy to compare. I think it's too easy for it to kind of psych you out. And I don't think it's necessary. Like, I think that every now and then, fine. But when I've done things before where it's basically been like, this workout happens like every 3 weeks, it's like, I'm not keen on that. I don't enjoy that. And there's no need to do that. Like, there's a million different ways to write that workout that it's not the same workout. And probably a bit particular in that area because I write workouts, so I know that. So yeah, you might have a thing similar to like that. That's just isn't really going to impact your training if you don't do it, but you don't like it and it just doesn't work for you, and that is totally fine. And I guess particularly in the current climate, it's just good to acknowledge that maybe now isn't the time for your grand comeback. Like, not to say, like, I think that running at the moment is awesome and I think it's great that we can still do it. So I would not at all be saying, like, don't be running by any stretch of the imagination. But there are a lot of external stresses happening. There's like financial pressure, and there's like all of this uncertainty around what is going to be happening, and you're dealing with possibly a lot more strain on your mental health from just being isolated and from like having to work from home and have kids at home and, like whatever else that you're doing. That is a lot of existing stress before you add a physical stressor onto that. So oftentimes, like I've seen a lot of people, like just there's a lot of promotion about how you should be like developing your new business empire right now, or like learning a new language or learning a new skill, or like whatever projects people have got on the go, which is fine if that is helping you when you've got time for it. I certainly don't, but it's also might not be the time for you to be really like pushing it with hard workouts and that kind of thing. It might be much more of a time for you to be focusing on the things that you really enjoy about running, being consistent, creating something that's sustainable, creating something that supports your mental health and your physical wellness, but also doesn't like put you in like a real hole in terms of energy, and also doesn't compromise your immune system, because that's another thing is that like really hard workouts do for a period of about 24 hours. And you know, like, not that you couldn't be doing any intensity at all, but you probably want to shy away from that top end and just do things that give to you rather than sort of like anything that's taking away at this stage. So I would also just say, don't feel the pressure to kind of like, oh, well, I've got to use this time because now I'm working from home, so I have more time to run, more time to train. I should come out of this being, you know, like this fit machine. And that's fine if that's working for you. But it's okay to come out of this any way you come out of it. And keeping a focus on the sort of the stuff that serves you and what you need, rather than what your fitness development would, you know, ordinarily call for, is going to be more important at this time, because you're not just, oftentimes it's not just you, it's, you know, you are supporting other family members and you're probably absorbing a lot of family anxiety and stress and all this sort of stuff. So it's just not something that you want to discount, and just give yourself the space to do that. So that's it for this week. Hopefully that answered the listener question. And just a reminder that Learn to Run registrations are open. It starts on the 4th of May, but there's an introductory program that happens in the 4 weeks before that, which has started now, which just sort of starts to establish those habits and just sort of like gets you into a good rhythm before you actually start. And if you sign up before the 17th of April, so I guess you've got, as of today, you've got like about 10 days for that, there is an early bird discount for 20% off, and you can get that at checkout using the code EARLY. If you have any questions at all about Learn to Run, you can just send me a message and I will check in with you guys next week.